Ladies and gentlemen, a good morning from Italy. I'm your host Menoscan, and welcome to another episode of SoulsTalk. So called because while I have an informal chat with the audience, I'm actually watching a video about a certain guy that maybe you may have heard of if you're into the Twitch or streaming community called DSP Gaming, while he makes an ass of himself playing some video games. Seriously, this guy, I don't know, maybe it's doing it on purpose by now, but he's seriously one of the worst video gamers I ever seen, period. No matter the game he's playing, it's like he has no learning ability whatsoever. And speaking of learning ability, yesterday we had a great stream with my co-host and our guest Alakia, and among other things we talked about Game of Thrones. Now, that found me in a particular position, because Alakia and Laura like the series, Eagle Series is on the fence. Me personally, I couldn't give a rat's ass about the series. But the thing is, I don't think I properly explained why. I don't think I managed to properly explain why Game of Thrones literally bores me. I'm really not interested in the series. I read the books, and even those didn't really strike me as that great. So after waking up this morning, I thought, well, maybe let's go and watch the recaps and the highlights, all the scenes, stuff like that. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe there is something in the series that makes it better than the books, even if pretty much. So I went over it again, and my opinion didn't change. It's boring. I'm really not interested in Game of Thrones, and the thing is, it's because of its focus. Game of Thrones basically focuses on politics. It's fantasy politics. That's real all it is. It's more bloody than most politics in the world, but it's pretty much just high fantasy. Well, high fantasy. Maybe it's too much. It's fantasy politics. And there is a thing. I'm not even interested. On that same note, I'm not interested in the game House of Cards either. Game of Cards. I'm not interested in House of Cards either. For the same reason, because of the focus on politics, backstabbings, and stuff like that. For a simple fact. I live in Italy. Except for the blood and murders, and not even that, because those kind of things are part of my history, of my everyday life, because don't forget that Italy has, Mafia, and 'Ndrangheta, Camorra, those kind of things don't happen that often, but then again, they don't happen that often in Game of Thrones too. The thing is, those kind of things are part of my everyday life, of the culture, of the history of my country. Politics, backstabbings, betrayals, sometimes even murders. I don't know how many people that were, judges, politicians, leaders were murdered by other people. And there is also there were many gray areas, because like some of his political enemies let that happen. They didn't work hard enough to save them, so... some of the stuff in Game of Thrones is actually amateurish compared to the stuff that I see in politics in Italy, and same thing with House of Cards. Really, same things with House of Cards. And the thing is, so I'm not really interested in something that I see basically that I studied, that we talk about, because in Italy we like to talk about the past a lot to legitimate most of the time some speech you want to give. So the only other appeal that this series could have for me is, one, the shock and gore value, and that's not an appeal to me. Not anymore. I mean, I read Battle Royale, the manga, and I read Berserk, which both... they handle the shock, gore, deaths, everything that Game of Thrones has to offer much better than Game of Thrones could ever do. So that's not really an appeal to me. And the only other appeal that is actually the most interesting, the part that I'm interested in Game of Thrones, is the part with a bit more fantasy to it, and not Daenerys, not her dragons. That's not the part that interests me. The only part about Game of Thrones, and I think it's also the part that is most popular about Game of Thrones for a reason. Even the most popular, one of the most popular characters, maybe the most popular storyline, is Jon Snow versus the White Walkers. That's really the only basically part of Game of Thrones that actually really interests me. But the problem is that to get to those parts, I would have to slog through everything else about Game of Thrones, which just doesn't interest me at all. And that's really my problem. There is very little about Game of Thrones that actually interests me, because everything else, I mean, take away the zombies, whatever, the knives, the swords, the impalements, and I mean, it's just boring to me. It's not something that really interests me. It's something that I live daily. The fight, the political fights for power. That's the thing, and also that actually found in a fantasy setting, and the fact that every character has the same motivation. Basically, they all do things for themselves. That's it. That's the only motivation every single character has. Everyone does it for himself, and that's also boring to me. Where are the psychopaths? Where are the guys that do things for the greater good, even if it's all in their heads? Where are the psychotics? And also the thing that there is an argument when I say this thing to people. Well, but because good people in things like Game of Thrones don't, they don't survive. And to that I have to say no. No, because most people say that being a good people basically equates to not being shrewd, not being smart, not being able to outsmart others and do shit. And that's the thing. The motivation is just that, a motivation. The methods are something else. There are plenty of good people, people that have good motivations. They do things that are selfless, who nonetheless are willing to do bad things to get to their result. That's really a more appealing that's a more appealing character arc to me. Instead of everyone doing the things for himself, for herself, or whatever. As I say, that the only part of Game of Thrones that interests me is Jon Snow versus the White Walkers, and so maybe what I should do, I think it's maybe there is a cut about it. Like, is there anyone that actually made like a super cut of Game of Thrones, all the Jon Snow episodes or scenes? I'd watch that. I'd really watch that, because that's the most interesting part to me. So yeah, maybe I'll do that. Like, I'll keep a recap of everything else that's happening, the politics and intrigues and whatever, and just watch the episodes and the parts with Jon Snow. Maybe I should do that. This looks like a rant, but it's not really a rant, because I say that it bores me, that it doesn't interest me, but I know it's a good series. Just like House of Cards is a good series. It's got Kevin fucking Spacey in it. It can't be a bad series. I know they're both good series. They just don't interest me, because all the things that people say that they never seen, there's something new, something that shocked them for how different it was for everything else, for me, in both fiction and in real life, it's something that I've already seen plenty of times. So, if I may leave you after, if I may leave you with a suggestion for a good read, there is another book series that is also dark, there is that, but it's more interesting to me because of the many different characters. It's much more interesting than Game of Thrones to me. It's called The Dark Company. It's a series, basically a company of mercenaries that can involve into conflicts, prophecies, stuff like that. So it's a bit more high fantasy, even if it's still dark than Game of Thrones, and it's different enough to keep my interest. So if you have, I bet you have an opposing opinion about this than me. Just let me know in the comments or on my social media or wherever you want. All the links are in the descriptions, and I see you next time. And DSP is trying to oh my god. Just if you want, just go on YouTube and just type "this is how you don't play." People have basically built a community about making videos on this guy's streams. That's how much he sucks. Bye bye.